Yes. Okay, everyone, thank you for your patience while we were figuring out again, the technical issues we were having with live streaming this meeting and making sure that the video Zoom recording is available as soon as possible to the public. Please check the district website, the board website for updates on that. We are getting that as soon as is possible. We are going to continue with our next item on the agenda, which is open records request policy, which is policy 2615. Thank you, Jesse, Dr. McGregory, and board members for the work to get this topic added to the agenda today. I'm anticipating that we can have a productive and proactive conversation about how we can address the revision of this policy and the addition of procedures to make sure that we as a board and district are fulfilling our duties to provide access to public records. The current policy, as posted on the website, was last updated in December of 2001. It references that our policy is to allow persons to have access to public records maintained by the school district in accordance with its policies and procedures and in accordance with the law. It explains the role of the legal custodian for records, that records shall be honored as soon as practicable and without delay, and that we will give reasons for denying the request in whole or part. It references the fee schedule and the locations where this information is displayed. And just as to sort of continue to preface this item is on the agenda so that we can find a way to address both an update to the policy and process for addressing the current outstanding and any future public records requests. I'd like to request that board members try to frame your questions focused on our policy or policies and or procedures from other districts that you've seen that appear to effectively address the requirements of fulfilling open records requests as required by law. I'm also requesting that you do not reference or discuss any specific individual requests that have been submitted to the district. For me personally, as an outcome, I'd like to define a process with timelines and outcomes for approaching this work so that we're as transparent as possible with the public about our plans and expectations. I'll take some notes on questions asked and work with Dr. McGregory and Sherry to follow up on this in the next 2 weeks. And if additional questions come to mind after this meeting, please feel free to send those as well. Tonight we have Dr. Richard McGregory, Senior Executive Director of Staff here in person, and Sherry Terrell-Webb, our legal counsel, with us virtually. Along with board member Castro and myself, the 4 of us make up the policy committee, which in larger context is guiding the relatively new work with Neola, a policy group dedicated to helping districts review and write policy for the work of the district in compliance with the complexity of fate and to be in compliance with the complexity of federal and state laws. So with that introduction, I'm going to hand it over to board member Castro first. He had a few other comments that he wanted to add as an introduction. And then I guess I'd like to go around the table for each board member to weigh in or ask questions. Dr. McGregory and Sherry, if there's anything that you would like to add after board member Castro, we can do that too before we start.
Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to take a brief second to help kind of define the challenge to board members and the public regarding public records, and that the usual staff person assigned to fulfilling public records requests, that position has been vacant for some time now, and so the responsibility of fulfilling public records requests has fallen upon other staff members and has been added as an additional responsibility to their regular day-to-day work, which has presented a challenge to fulfilling these record requests. The other challenge is that it is a interdepartmental coordination to fulfill them. So, for example, the records request comes to the email, which is managed by our legal department, but the records request itself may request information about the budget. So then that staff member has to coordinate to get that information with people from our finance department to get that. And then just the nature of complexity of fulfilling data requests may be more time and labor intensive than what meets the eye. So my questions tonight will be around, what can the board do to help build capacity to fulfill these requests? So sure, if you'd like to chime in to help, or if someone else would like to, feel free, but that was my attempt at trying to define the challenge.
And I think you stated it perfectly. In talking with Dr. McGregory, when I started in January of 2018, there was one attorney who, in addition to being the attorney that was responsible for all special ed matters, who did public records requests. And at that point, he even said, I'm overwhelmed. And the more challenges we encountered, including COVID, the further behind we've gotten. I am talking to board member Gomez Schmidt today. I don't know, we could throw people and money at the problem, but at the end of the day, I don't know that it would necessarily speed it up, or it would only speed it up for a certain amount of time until there was no more money or no more people. I have had conversations with others in other districts, and what I'm told is that for the most part, districts are in similar positions and are behind, but they are using outside counsel to answer. And then some districts just don't get as many, but being one of the big five, we get a significant amount. And so, in talking, and I'm not just talking about talking to other attorneys, I've actually talked to people in other districts to see what they're doing and how they're doing it. And they have even less people than we do. And again, it's, as board member Castro indicated, it's the complexity of the request. It's not understanding necessarily how to get what you're looking for. For example, if you ask me for a concept, I can't search for a concept. I can search for specific words like advanced learning or curriculum or fire safety. But to talk about just general concepts, because of the way, especially digitally, our documents are stored, we just can't search that way. And I think that causes some of the angst because people believe that we can search on concepts, and it makes it extremely difficult. It's also a difficulty when you get any and all emails, because that could be hundreds of thousands of documents. When I was talking to board member Gomez Schmidt earlier, for one request, it was 15,000 documents. You literally have to touch every document before you can release it. And so, it's the reading through, and it's not really even reading at this point, it's skimming for words because of the way the searches are set up. And so, in the short term, I have some ideas, but I think we would solve it just for a short period of time, and then we'd be back to where we are until unless the decision was made to create a whole department to do it.
Yeah, we'll go around and again, I appreciate the difficulty that we are facing here, but also recognizing that we do have an obligation to the public to fulfill requests and figure out how to work with the public in that regard. And so very interested in trying to problem solve this with you, Sherry, to figure out how we can get the resources or figure out a process to improve this. So
One clarification, we are still fulfilling requests. It's just that
no,
it's not. We're fulfilling them as
Yes.
best we can.
yes,
And I
sorry.
did want to say, you asked about policy updates, and so a few of the things that I noted that might be helpful to add would be what is a record, name an appropriate custodian or designee. And that's many of our policies fail to name that it could be a designee. So I think we need to add that. We need to discuss what the exceptions are to the presumption of disclosure, because there are a few, and include that. And then lay out the fees. I think we just mentioned it. And then also indicate that we use DPI's record retention schedule for all district records. And then the procedures, as we've discussed, will be laid out directly in conjunction with the policy.
Okay. Thank you for that starting point. I appreciate it. I'm going to go this way around the room and adding in the folks that are virtual too. Board Member Vandermillen, followed by Board President Muldrow.
Yes, all the board members probably received what I sent you last night, which is a primer on the open records law, along with sample proposals from other districts and districts of our size, particularly the Green Bay one, which is almost identical to our size, also is quite detailed. Defines what a record is, which Sherry has openly stated is important. It establishes who a custodian is as well. Also sets forth that unless it also sets forth when requests can be followed, when they can't. And it states that the presumption, we could also, and I think we need to put in there, the presumption that routine things take much less time versus complicated legal matters. But here's the thing. We have a legal duty under section 19.31, which states that it is declared to be the public policy of the state that all persons are entitled to the greatest possible information regarding the affairs of government. And the law shall be construed in every instance with a presumption of complete public access. It doesn't say anything on time, it says complete public access. We don't have a statutory exception that interrupts it, which was found in Hagan versus Board of Regents, which is April 2018. And this was in the materials that I sent you yesterday. But very simply, the open records law needs to state, this is the record, this is how long on average it takes, this is how long cost-wise, and how many attorney hours. These things, this policy hasn't been updated since 2001. I was in law school in 2004. I started in 2001. And I'm celebrating my 20th anniversary. It doesn't take 20 years to update a policy, but I understand we're swamped, and I don't blame us one bit for taking this long. It's too important to mess around with. Therefore, very simply, what we need to do is to look at policies in our district and adopt our own. I believe I sent some documents on that, how we can adopt our own policy where we state, when we get a record that is requested, it goes to a specific person on that date. Then they get an email stating it was received. Doesn't have to be a long email, just an email saying it was received. And then there's nothing wrong with sending a follow-up email within 10 days. This can be filled, this cannot be filled. This will need more time or not. Any of those can be in there. Then I think you need to put a definition of the exceptions to the open records law, which the statute lists every one of them that are exceptions. And I think that needs to be spelled out. I think the policy and the procedure need to be on the same page on this one. In fact, I absolutely do. It's the only way that it will work and make sense. Because people don't just need a policy, they need to be able to understand how it's used. And those are, and one other thing. Sorry, give me 1 second because I'm trying to read my notes. Just stating, according to Boardman and Clark, the DOJ has noted that 10 working days is generally a reasonable time for responding to a simple request. For requests that are broader or redaction, we could state a reasonable time for responding may be longer, and we should use that sentence. It may be longer. But it's a start. And right now, our policy isn't doing us any favors. That's it.
Thank you, Board Member Vandermeulen. May I ask you one question about the Green Bay policy? They had both a procedures and a policy. They're both pretty extensive. Is that?
Yes, and I think they should both be extensive and they should both be included.
Yeah.
And the reason why is because people need to know how to use it. Otherwise, we're gonna have 3 million questions of, is this covered? Is this not covered? When is this covered? And the amount of emails we'll get in confusion will only end up adding to our workload rather than subtracting.
Well, and what I do like about the policy work coming forward and the end goal of that is that we are going to have a full policy suite that is going to be accompanied by administrative guidelines that will match and show the procedures for making sure that the policies get implemented. And so I think this is part of our policy process going forward. But I do think prioritizing this one at the moment is a good idea. Board Member Muldrow.
Thank you so much, Chair. I want to ask Sherry, can you walk us through what the steps are to fulfilling an open records request? What are the things that we need to do to fulfill an open records request? How many steps are involved?
So it comes in through the email. The office manager then takes that email, assigns it to whoever's the next person on the queue. At the same time, she sends out an email to the respondent. We do have, or the requester, we do have new software. So then what the next step she takes is she uploads a copy of what the requester is asking for into a folder, and she shares that folder with the person assigned to do the public records request. That person then goes in and pulls the information that's requested. Depending on what it is, they'll send a request for documents. So if it's a request for emails, that has to go to someone on Dr. McCrae's team. That person then has to do the search, put the search in a folder, and then once notifies us that, we've completed the search. And then it starts the process of going through however many documents there are to make sure the documents can be released. And then once they've completed all of that, they mark it as responsive, put a note on it to the office manager, and the office manager downloads it and sends it to the requester. If it's a full reply, meaning that we are going to fully fulfill it, we found the documents that we think are responsive, there are no redactions, and there are no documents that will be excluded, we just send a file saying this completes your public records request. Otherwise, whoever is responsible for filling the public records request has to write a memo detailing what they're giving, what's not included, and what's redacted.
Thank you for talking us through that process. I reached out to another government entity because we're not the only entity that's expected to provide open records request, and asked them what this process looked like for them. They gave me 6 really simple steps. So their steps were receive request for records, acknowledge request, forward request to appropriate division, receive records from division, review records, draft response letter, route records for legal review, and send records to requester. I think having a sense of what all is involved in our process, and then the variables that can make that process more cumbersome, could be really helpful to us as a board. That agency actually had a pretty tremendous backlog of record requests themselves, and they went into a process of trying to fix that. And I looked at some of the documents that they crafted in order to do that. I want to move on to kind of questions I had specific to our process and our approach to open records requests. And Sherry, I'm not going to ask that you answer all of these this evening, but I am going to send them to you and hope that we can use them as part of how we follow up in this conversation moving forward. The one question I will ask you to answer this evening, if you're able to, is how many open records requests do we receive a year on average?
I don't know. I haven't counted them.
So I guess I would add that to the stack of questions that it would be great if folks can follow up with us on. My first question is the MMSD policy on open records requests consistent with both best practice and state statute? What is the MMSD process for fulfilling open records requests? How does confidentiality impact MMSD's ability to fulfill open records requests? How many open records requests does MMSD receive on average a year? How many pages or documents are included in the average open records request? How does the size of the request impact the timeline for fulfilling it? What percentage of open records requests submitted to the district go unfulfilled for 6 months or more? How do we communicate the MMSD process for fulfilling open records requests after somebody has made a public records request of the district? In the interest of transparency, how can MMSD strengthen our ability to fulfill open records requests? What is MMSD's process for retaining records depending on the nature of the record? How long is the district expected to maintain records related to a variety of areas? What is our process for disposal of records? How does the district charge for open records, and what is the total amount paid by requesters of public records in 2022? Can you tell me the difference between the amount invoiced and the amount paid, if there is a difference? And what is the process for considering a request withdrawn or abandoned? I'll follow up with you in email, Sherry, and make sure you have all of those questions. But those are some of kind of the major areas that I think we need to understand thoroughly in order to update this policy and align it well with best practice, or in order to recognize how our policy already aligns with best practice. So thank you very much, Board Member Gomez-Schmidt, for bringing this conversation to the board. I think this is an initial conversation and we'll have to continue to have this conversation, but thank you so much for getting us started.
Yeah, thank you. Board Member Simpkin, do you have any questions or comments, or?
I do. I have a few questions. So Sherry, my first one is, when you said that the open records requests are being dispersed to the next person in the queue, who in our district now is involved in that initial process? Is that only people within the legal team?
Yes, it's just the legal team.
Okay.
Everyone on my team except for the Title IX coordinator.
Okay, so then my next question is, I heard you say something about how some districts that don't have legal teams use outside counsel.
Yes.
I'm wondering, as you've imagined some ways to adjust this process, is it reasonable from your perspective for us to open up the number of people who are doing those searches and then have it sent to the legal team at the end just to review and make sure we've got everything legally that we need to have addressed?
Are you talking about the text searches that I was talking about, the member of TJ's team who goes through and does the searches of email and Google Docs, or?
I guess I'm talking about all of the open records requests. So I'm wondering if they really have to start with the legal team, or if, because you are understaffed and have a lot to do, if it would be far more efficient and still legal for us to start with other members within the administration and then have the legal team be the last step instead of the first in this process.
Only to the extent that those others would be able to figure out what was being requested. I mean, part of the issue is to figure out first, what exactly is the person looking for? As the policy is written, it used to sit in Ross's department. And from my understanding, that became untenable as they became more specific, more broad, but also more specific, where there needed to be more intervention and understanding of what actually was being sought. I mean, certainly another department could take it, but at the end of the day, I think you'd still have delays just because of the technicality of the statute and figuring out what's included, what's not, is this a proper request? The easy ones are always the ones where, they don't ask for a record. They ask, can you tell me how many advanced learning students you have? That's not a request for a record. If you state a request for a record, I can get you a record. Those are always the easiest ones to do, but it's very few and far between that we get a request like that.
Okay, so this might be a complete, I think I'm interested in talking about process here. And I guess I'm just wondering if the requests could be narrowed down simply by instead of just having an email that comes to the school district, by sending out a Google form that the person has to fill out to help narrow down the request to determine if it is indeed an open records request, or to take something that's vague or wide reaching and give them the opportunity to narrow it down before staff even have their hands on it. Is that something that seems at all practical or that you've considered doing?
I can't envision how that would work. Are you saying download, the requester would go to our website to download a form to fill out?
Well, I'm saying, I mean, it could work operationally, it could be a lot of different ways, but in the most simple format possible, you get an email and you respond by saying, thank you so much for your open records request. Please complete this. And it takes, and then it guides them towards specificity, towards, you said designating, I can't remember the terminology you used, a custodian of the records, something that helps to narrow it down before we start working on it. Is that legal to do something like that?
Sure, if we could figure out how to make it work.
Okay, well, I'm just
I can't see it, so.
Okay, I'm kind of imagining a funnel where you start with like a huge idea, and in the end you come up with, like something really specific, like dates and a few words, or the main concept or the main idea, something that helps people narrow down most of what's coming in. But again, this is on the procedural side. This isn't on the policy side.
Right.
So I think that's where a lot of my interest lies in this conversation, is how can we take the legal requirements that we have and make it easier for the district to meet those. And so I know I just threw out a few ideas, but I think to me that's a huge part of where we need to be going in a district, is figuring out how to simplify it so that people aren't unintentionally clogging up the system, and that the requests can come through, and that we have the staff, we have enough staff in place that are trained in being able to meet these requests. So that's my thoughts around it. I'll pass it along to the next person.
Thank you. Board Member Nichols.
Yes, I would say that my fellow board members have asked already a lot of good questions, particularly for President Muldrow. So I'm looking forward to responses as you're able to get them to us, Sherry, and I appreciate Board Member Vandermeulen for sharing the primer email and making sure that we all understand the statute And thank you, Board Member Gomez Schmidt for getting this on the agenda. I think the only question I would ask, and again, Sherry, this is more related to process, probably not as much on the policy. I think the things you named around some policy updates, I could kind of see in the language. But from a policy perspective, procedural perspective, you said that even if we added more staff or more money towards the issue, it might work for a while, and then we would probably be back in the same position. And so I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on that, because it seemed like in the beginning, as we were introducing this tonight, you were acknowledging that there was one dedicated position that was vacant. And even before that position was vacant, it's been, there's just been an overwhelming number of requests. So I'm trying to understand how having more staff allocated or something wouldn't help for the long, for the immediate and kind of long term.
I think it would help for the immediate just because it would clean it up, but we would still end up having the requests are getting more and more complex. And so the more complex they are, the more time they take. And, the ones we're getting now are nothing like even when I first started. And so, yes, we could clean it up, but even just having one person, the amount of time it would take, they wouldn't be as far behind, but they still wouldn't be current.
Okay, I understand what you're saying, because there would be more time needed to fulfill. And so when you say complex, can you just speak a little bit about what makes a request complex from your perspective, and what shift have you seen over time?
So one I can think of, and Ross loves me when he gets public records requests, because and it usually happens around budget time, right? And so the questions are more complex because in order to answer the request, we have to educate the requester on what school district budgeting is, as opposed to budgeting for a corporation, or as opposed to budgeting for your home, because they will ask for things that seem simple, but we just don't do it that way. So it could be a request for, I want to see all debits and credits and the related account line. That's a difficult request for Ross to do because we don't budget that way. We budget based on our revenue, so that's not really a credit. And then the account lines, it's not names of accounts, it's just numbers. And so it's walking through and going, it's a back and forth with the requester saying, okay, I don't have that, or I can send you what I have, but I'm thinking it's not what you want. And then they'll come back and say, nope, that's not what I was looking for. And so then we have to sit down with Ross and try to figure out, okay, here's the request, Ross, what do you think they're looking for? And eventually we'll get there. It just takes time.
Thank you for sharing that example. So I didn't realize that you were kind of engaged in that level of, not you specifically, but your team going kind of back and forth with some of the requesters, which I think is going back to Board Member Simpkins' initial suggestion, which is perhaps if there were a series of questions that accompanied the requester's initial, kind of triggering of the process, maybe a series of questions would help kind of vet a little bit about like what they're really hoping to get. I don't know if that would help expedite the handling of the process or not, but I think I'm understanding what you mean by more complex.
And I mean, we could try it. People, and it's interesting, initially, depending on how frequently you make requests, there are some people we just call and say, look, what are you really looking for? Because what you asked me for, we don't have.
Okay.
And so as they become more familiar with what the district has and what is within the parameters of the law, then it becomes a little more streamlined. So yes, we could try, with the response, sending out a form saying, can you help us, especially in those that don't appear to be so simple? Can you help us refine your request?
Okay, and then my final question is, would we, or is there any, I guess, difference in responding to open records from our media folks, or is everybody treated the exact same? And
Everyone is the same.
I know.
Everyone is the same.
Okay. Thanks.
Board Member Castro.
Thank you. Sherry, in your comments, you talked about other districts and agencies have contracted out some of this. I guess I am curious in exploring that option, but for this conversation, what do the logistics of that look like on its face? Like, what do they have access to, given student and staff privacy laws and things of that nature?
Well, the districts that I've talked to and the attorneys I've talked to, they only hire other attorneys. So it would not be an issue with regard to release. And generally, for student information, we can spot those up front and just, if it's a parent, we say, well, as a parent, you actually have the right to your student's record without filing a public records request. But if it's someone from outside, we will generally look at it on its face and say, this looks like a request for a student record, which we cannot give you. But if your request is for something else, please let us know. And that's sort of an explanation to explain that if it's another attorney, I'd be comfortable. They would have access to the software that stores the results from the search, is all they'd have access to. So if it were 20,000 documents for one search, they would only get those documents and nothing else.
Got it. Okay. Well, as we continue this conversation with updating our policy and procedures with best practice, I think it's at least worth to weigh the pros and cons of that, to add capacity to our department.
Any other questions, Board Member Castro?
That is it.
Okay, thank you. Moving into, as we move through this budget process, I guess, Sherry and Dr. McGregory, I would be interested in knowing what type of short-term investment might be able to help with this work that needs to be done. And so if there is something that needs to be added to the budget, or if it's already there and it's just a matter of working out procedure or whatever, if there's anything that the board needs to do with that, if you could let us know. If board members have additional questions that you want added to the queue of questions, please send those to Dr. McGregory. I've also started compiling a list from the discussion we had tonight, and we'll share that with Dr. McGregory as well. I really do appreciate us having this conversation tonight. I think it is important to work collaboratively with our administration to get this figured out and know that the district and the board is committed to being responsive to open records requests that do come to us. Dr. Jenkins, I see you coming on screen. Would you like to add anything?
Yeah, just
Wrap
briefly,
this up.
thank you. And I really appreciate the way that Board Member Castro set this meeting up and then just followed up with our own legal counsel in terms of this. The challenges are out there. I think there are opportunities when we're working together, as you just said, and it's a collaborative process, but it is definitely one of those things that's a shortage. Not only here, I can say from my previous experiences too, and I had to go outside and get an attorney, but then it became too expensive. So if not today, tomorrow, but if we walk in it together, I'm certain we can get this here resolved as well. So thank you all for your comments. We'll take them back, we'll chew them up, and we'll keep it moving.
All right, thank you. I think that brings us to the end of our discussion for tonight. And with that, I will entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second, Joanna, are you still with us for your advisory vote? I'm not sure if Joanna is
Yes,
still.
I am. I
You
approve.
are. Hello, Joanna. Thank you. Thank you for your vote. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. All right, motion carries 6-0. With that, we are adjourned. Board members, we do have a brief recess and then we are going into closed session for the next meeting. So
Thank you.
thank you, everyone. Have a good night.
We'll take 4 minutes.